Good evening and thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Nick Blumberg. Mayor Brandon Johnson tells big company and wealthy Chicagoans it's time to pay up.
This is just the beginning of the next phase of our struggle for justice and liberation.
The mayor's budget proposal calls for more than $600 million in new revenue, trying to tackle a gaping budget deficit without hiking property taxes.
They are not arresting people who are a threat. They are arresting our mothers, they are arresting our fathers, they are arresting and taking the workers that we need.
Federal courts continue to stymie President Trump's aggressive push into Chicago, slamming immigration agents for apparently defying a judge's order limiting the use of tear gas and keeping in place a block on deploying National Guard troops.
Democrats in Congress refuse to fund the federal government, and because of this, many of our operations are impacted.
O'Hare and Midway join a slew of airports that refuse to air a partisan video from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Meanwhile, state lawmakers head back to Springfield eyeing transit funding, energy costs, and anti-Trump efforts. Former House Speaker Michael Madigan reports to federal prison in West Virginia. And a Chicago legend sees its shine dimmed, as scientists say the famous rat hole was almost certainly made by a squirrel. And now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Mitchell Armentrout of the Chicago Sun-Times, Araceli Gomez-Aldana of WBEZ, and our own Heather Sharon. Let's get right to it. Lots to cover this week. Heather, we will get to the city budget in just a moment, but first, there was some court action just this afternoon over President Trump's efforts to deploy troops in Chicago. Fill us in on the latest.
Well, the Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to lift the block put in place by both a district court judge and an appellate court panel this week. He is asking for the power to immediately deploy about 700 National Guard troops into Chicago and the surrounding areas. The Supreme Court gave lawyers for the state and the city until 5 p.m. Monday to respond, so I think it's pretty safe to say that they would not act until before then. But his argument to the Supreme Court is that essentially the appellate court and the district court impermissibly substituted their judgment for his judgment that there is at least the danger of rebellion in Illinois and Chicago, and that federal agents have been unable to execute federal law. Those are both very contested claims.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes. Really the first major test of the president's powers here. Much more in immigration and National Guard troops issues to get to coming up. But Heather, sticking with you for a minute, Mayor Johnson's budget proposal out this week has $617 million in new taxes and fees aimed largely at well-to-do residents, big businesses. What's that revenue going to fund?
Well, essentially the basic operations of the city. When you have a budget deficit of nearly $1.2 billion, if you are talking about the very meat of city organizations, police, fire, garbage pickup. And without Johnson sort of supporting a property tax increase, there's really no other way, he says, than to ask big businesses to pay a little bit more, or as he keeps saying, to put a little bit more skin in the game.
Yeah, I mean, he really promised and he campaigned on no property taxes increase, and I was really waiting to see how creative he was going to get. Of course, we saw some of that creativity coming in with even a social media tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, coming in with some of these interesting ways to generate revenue, but obviously trying to meet the desires of progressive alders to maintain some of the programs here without putting things that are more regressive on there, like water fees or garbage fees. This budget does include a $21 a month head tax on firms with more than 100 employees. Businesses have called this a job killer. Of course, we used to have a much smaller one that was eliminated under the Emanuel administration. But, Mitch, if this passes, how likely is it that companies simply just pull up stakes and leave immediately?
We're talking about companies like Google and McDonald's, like huge corporations that they're not going to pull up stakes immediately because of something like this. But yeah, I mean, it's effectively punishing large corporations for being big employers, and that's why you're going to see such a huge pushback from this from a lot of members of the council. We're already hearing major pushback from the business community. But yeah, this is exactly what Brandon Johnson has promised since he was first elected. Just ways to get the wealthy and big corporations to spend for programs that lower income Chicagoans will depend on.
Yeah, and of course the mayor's saying this is just 3% or so of employers, but when you've got a massive workforce and you're paying $21 a month, that's quite a lot of money. Heather, this also is an effort, this plan to avoid any sort of layoffs or furloughs. You have to imagine that the mayor's allies in labor unions are pretty happy to see that happen, unions that have heavily backed him.
They certainly are. They are less happy and a little bit skeptical of a plan to declare $1 billion in tax increment financing districts to be in surplus. That would send more than $500 million to the Chicago public schools to help them deal with their budget deficit, and it would fill a good chunk of that massive budget gap that the city had. So if those funds aren't being used for redevelopment projects, the construction workers don't work, asphalt layers don't work. So there are a lot of questions about whether that sort of massive surplus would require projects sort of that have been in the pipeline to be canceled. Now, administration officials told us yesterday that no active projects are going to be impacted. The devil is always in the detail. Different people have different definitions of what active means. And to be frank, we have not seen the 2024 Cook County TIF report, which is supposed to come from Cook County Clerk Monica Gordon's office. I would sure like to see that report, because it would give us a better sense of sort of where that money is. Although, to be clear, there was $3 billion in TIF funds countywide by the end of 2023.
Yeah, so certainly quite a bit of money
Yes.
sloshing around there. Araceli, the mayor says when he was making his address to council, he's saying this budget will kind of shore up the city against attacks from the Trump administration. But do you think most Chicagoans see a city budget in those terms?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are just kind of wondering, is this a Band-Aid? Is this going to help us short term, or is there some structural, actual change, some vision here? And I think people are going to kind of want to look to see where the numbers fall. But I agree. I think people are like saying, how is this going to help me?
Right. Yeah. What is this going to do to my day-to-day life? And Mitch, there was lots of praise from progressive aldermen, after this was released. But, as you mentioned, some of the pushback already starting to happen. Do you think the mayor's team is anxious about whether we'll see as contentious a budget season as we did last time around?
Yeah, I mean, I think Heather especially, I think a lot of reporters have PTSD thinking about the budget hearings last year. I mean, it was so contentious. Threatened a lot of people's holiday schedules.
Yeah.
Hopefully that doesn't happen this time around.
Don't they know who you are?
Exactly.
But yeah, there's going to be such a huge pushback to these business taxes. I'm especially interested to see Facebook, Meta, Reddit, these social media companies that are facing a potentially huge tax burden. Other states have tried to implement a tax like this. It's not been passed. Washington State and Minnesota are looking at something similar. And the idea of implementing that system and then turning it around to generate $30 million next year seems ambitious, but that's even if there's not an army of lobbyists descending on City Hall as we speak, which there absolutely is.
Yeah, I can hear them swirling right now. Yeah, I mean, with a new revenue stream, it's not as simple as turning something on versus if you're increasing the property tax or, putting the grocery tax back into place where we already have a mechanism. If it's a whole new revenue stream, it's a lot more complicated.
But what the mayor is hoping is that there are enough sort of new creative ways to generate revenue in this budget that he does not suffer sort of the wholesale revolt that he saw on the Progressive Caucus last year. Now, if he manages to keep sort of his Progressive Caucus allies together and he adds a couple of the more moderate aldermen like Alderman Jason Irvin and Alderman Pat Dowell, those sort of people, he will have an easier time getting it through. I think that is his calculation. Somebody like Alderman Brian Hopkins and Alderman Brendan Riley, I don't want to say that they wouldn't vote for a Johnson budget under any circumstances, but they are diametrically opposed on sort of theories of government. So Johnson is clearly not sort of trying to win their votes as much as he's trying to sort of say, this is my vision for progressive government in Chicago, which is something we didn't see last year.
Yeah, and then to just add to that, I mean, I think when it comes down to the debates, if we are going to tax people that are huge companies, that's a better kind of debate to have than raising property taxes, if we want to give money to schools, I think everybody would say that's a good idea, right? So I think that there's some strategic there.
Yeah, a stronger baseline of,
Yeah.
of widespread agreement, I'm sure they hope. Well, Heather, some other city news this week. The Inspector General says the mayor's top aide, Jason Lee, should be fired for failing to cooperate with an investigation. Remind us what the watchdog was looking into here.
Well, this stems from a complaint made by Alderman Bill Conway, who said that he had asked the mayor's office to help him clear an encampment of unhoused people near the Ogilvie train station and Union Station, and the mayor's top aide, Jason Lee, basically said, well, you're going to vote for our stuff in the time-honored horse trading, where is mine tradition that we all know and love in Chicago politics. Now, Alderman Conway said that was inappropriate because he needed public safety help, so he filed a complaint with the watchdog. Now, the watchdog said that she asked to interview Jason Lee, and he refused because he wanted a lawyer from the Department of Law to sit with him. The Inspector General said, nope, that's not permissible, and basically that's where the probe ended. Now, Jason Lee says, look, it's my right to have whoever I want, whatever lawyer I want there. The watchdog said, no, this is a little bit of sort of behind the scenes tension between the mayor's office and the Inspector General. They changed the law after all of this to make sure that people like Jason Lee could say, hey, I want somebody from the Department of Law to sit with me in these interviews. But it's clear that there was a deep breakdown between the mayor's office and the Inspector General, which are supposed to be an adversarial relationship. But this was a deep disagreement about how sort of the watchdog functions should operate.
Yeah, and of course the mayor will soon be looking for a new
Yes.
watchdog with Deborah Witzberg on her way out. All right, well, federal government still shut down. Local airports are among some around the country that are refusing to play a video from DHS Secretary Kristi Noem blaming Democrats for not funding the government. Araceli, critics are saying, and it's hard to watch the video and think otherwise, that this is a fairly straightforward use of government resources for political ends.
I mean, I think that once reports started kind of coming up of why is this video being played while I'm waiting here in the airport, and people started taking it down and just citing that it was political content. I mean, it does read like it's blaming one side for the government shutdown, and a lot of people are kind of wondering, how did this even kind of come to be anyways? And of course, here in Chicago, that's not going to be the case because they said they're not going to air it.
Yeah, but the Hatch Act is fairly straightforward about what you can and cannot do as a government employee. All right, well, lots of court action this week on the immigration front, in addition to that filing to the Supreme Court. Heather, a federal judge has twice warned agents to turn on their body cameras and wants them to lay off the tear gas. Sounds like she was a little frustrated that that message wasn't getting through.
You know, federal judges do not typically get angry during court hearings, and I think Judge Sarah Ellis was angry. She said that she wanted Border Patrol and ICE agents to be wearing body-worn cameras when they're out in the streets of Chicago enforcing federal law. Federal lawyers said, well, sure, but we don't have body-worn cameras for everybody, and we deployed tear gas because our agents were under threat. So there is a real conflict here between sort of what a judge says, you know, law enforcement agents under the federal authorities has to do, and sort of what they say they are capable doing. This is essentially the same argument that is before SCOTUS right now, right? Can local judges, federal judges, sort of direct how federal agents operate in Chicago while enforcing immigration law? So we're going to have a full hearing on Monday where the judge tried to haul the head of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement into her courtroom to answer questions. He has been sent back to Washington, perhaps a little bit abruptly, so somebody else is going to have to answer the judge's questions on Monday, but perhaps we will get more indication about what she is going to do to sort of, you know, change the way these immigration raids, which are very militarized and very disruptive, from going forward.
It's an interesting response to say that we don't have body cameras, especially, I mean, it is a little bit difficult because there is a government shutdown, but we also know that there is a lot of money going into immigration operations currently in the country right now. So Interesting.
Yeah, well, speaking of some other courthouses here, Mitch, Cook County courthouses, other property now off limits for agents looking to make warrantless arrests. Do we have any idea exactly how the county plans to enforce that ban on keeping agents off its property?
We don't, just like we don't really have a great idea of how that can be enforced anywhere. That's just kind of this push and pull between federal authorities and local ones. But yeah, this order from Chief Judge Timothy Evans, a lot of local officials have been calling on him to issue such an order for the last few weeks as these immigration rates have been ramping up. And this is top of mind for a lot of local officials. We see state lawmakers down in Springfield for veto session. They're going to be considering probably several bills looking at limiting where ICE agents can operate and deport people. It's a lot of progressive state lawmakers are calling this an ICE out campaign, with again the idea being, can the state bar federal agents from courthouses, places like hospitals where we've seen folks be taken away by masked agents, schools, state universities. That's kind of the best that state lawmakers say they can do at this point. But again, it's a pretty short time for the state to get it done.
And to be clear, I think in this case, we're still talking about they can still execute judicial warrants.
Right.
So if there is a name, you have a warrant, you can still go and execute that warrant. But if, no civil arrest. So people that are just there for sometimes to be a witness, sometimes they're a family member of somebody that's in court. And I think those are the kind of things that, the judge is saying, let's not do that. It's kind of hurting the judicial system here.
There's also nothing that says the federal government has to follow this order, right? Because separation of powers and federalism, it's still a thing. The state and the local governments do not get to tell the federal government what to do. It works in the other direction. As much as many people would like, Governor Pritzker or Mayor Johnson to start arresting ICE agents or that sort of thing, it's really not clear that this order is going to have any impact, but I think it is perhaps more symbolic than anything else to say, hey, we don't want this sort of operation here on our property.
Well, we're joined as well now by Shruti Singh from Bloomberg News. Thanks for being with us. And Shruti, we've seen a lot of immigration enforcement targeting people on the job. There was a raid on the rideshare lot at O'Hare, folks taken from construction sites. Is there any sense of, could heightened enforcement have sort of economic ripple effects if folks are, being taken away from their workplaces?
Yeah, that is something that when I've talked to investors, not specifically about Chicago, but just a lot of different municipalities, states, and local communities, investors are starting to question the economic impacts of all this federal risk in terms of funding. And so while they're not specifically talking about any specific city, they're saying, we're going to look at a macro impact and then level up in terms of like credit ratings and things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things for them to consider. When we were talking for a bit about the city budget, but you've also been reporting on Chicago public schools. They're drawing down hundreds of millions from lines of credit. There was also a major asset manager offloaded basically all the school district's debt that it had held. Are these potentially warning signs for CPS?
So in terms of the asset manager, it's Noem, which is actually a Chicago-based asset manager, and it has a long history with CPS. During the budget impasse, when CPS had to take what they called crisis debt, Noem was among the lenders that helped give them funding. And Noem actually sold into a rally during early September in terms of high-yield bonds. And so it remains to be seen, was this an opportunistic, and they haven't commented, so it remains to be seen, was this just an opportunistic sale during a rally or something bigger? But at the same time, there's no question that there are funding questions and risks for CPS.
Yeah, there's going to be something that I know a lot of folks are paying close attention to. All right, well, we already talked a little bit, Mitch, about Springfield lawmakers heading back for their fall veto session. Obviously, the Trump administration is top of mind, but what are some of the other big priorities that you're watching out for?
Number one is the mass transit fiscal cliff facing the CTA, Metra, and PACE. We've been talking about this for months. Looks like that number, looks like that number now is somewhere around 200 million, 230 million. Deficit that is going to run into next year. So lawmakers, the state Senate passed a bill back in the spring that would have imposed a $1.50 delivery tax to help fund these systems long term, along with some reforms in the governance of it. But that bill was dead on arrival in the House. Lawmakers, we've kind of been talking about this just for so long. The governance side of this seems to be pretty well agreed upon. as far as this Northern Illinois Transit Authority. But again, it's just going to be what type of tax are lawmakers willing to swallow a few months ahead of a primary election. I think that's the big question. You know, there is this cliff, it is hanging out next year, but I think there's a really good shot that this gets pushed to January. Again, just kind of kicking the can down the road once more.
But it gives us an opportunity to keep talking about it for months and months and months.
What a treat.
And all right, so how about our friends, the Chicago Bears? State Representative Cam Buckner has introduced a bill trying to hang them up a little bit, potentially.
Right, yeah, it's Cam Buckner. He's the state rep. His district covers Soldier Field. He does not want to see the Bears move. But basically, this bill that he filed is more of a, I would call it a symbolic bill. It's probably not going to move this session, but really just puts up a lot of huge guardrails for any team that wants to have a stadium publicly financed, just in terms of auditing the dollars that go into projects and making teams reimburse municipalities if they don't meet certain criteria. Again, all just kind of underscoring that there's no appetite for any sort of mega development bill that Bears President Kevin Warren has been talking about for 3 years now. And we saw even on national broadcasts, Kevin Warren has kind of gone on the air with announcers talking about this bill that they make it sound like it's a done deal, but it's really couldn't be farther from the truth at this point.
And even though the Bears are on a winning streak, which I'm very happy about, I just, when I look at all of the stuff that lawmakers have to do in Springfield in this veto session, and we're talking about transit, we're talking about energy reform, we're talking about cannabis, it just feels like it's kind of low on the list.
There's also a fiscal backdrop in terms of the state and local situation. So, you've talked about the city budget, we've talked about CPS, but Governor Pritzker also just a few weeks ago asked the state departments to really pull back and put more money into reserves because of these questions about the federal, state, and the relationship between the two. So the fiscal backdrop isn't necessarily helpful.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. Well, and talking as well about those governance issues with transit, seeing an estimate go from 700 million to 200 million has really led some lawmakers to say, we need transparency into the finances there. I mean, for any public body, a transit agency, whatever, how hard is it for them to engender trust with lawmakers when they don't feel like they have a sense of how taxpayer dollars are being spent?
I mean, I think that's an age-old question that I think a lot of us reporters have been asking for I don't even know how long, but let's just put this in perspective. There is still a fiscal cliff. There's still a question about where this funding is going to come from. It may be smaller, it may be pushed off a little bit, but it hasn't disappeared. 200
million is still a heck of a lot of money. All right, Springfield adjacent news. Heather, former House Speaker Michael Madigan is officially a federal inmate, but still appealing his conviction.
Correct. He reported this week to a West Virginia prison camp. He had requested to be in Indiana, closer to his family. The Department of Corrections did not see fit to send him there. He is 83 years old, and he is serving a 7.5-year sentence. Now, he's going to get time for good behavior. There's also the possibility that he would be released because of his age or medical concerns, but what a fall from just being the uncontested just ruler of all things Springfield to now being a federal inmate, I think was a moment for all of us sort of political junkies to sort of, take a deep breath and, sort of the arc of his career. However, it's another indication that Chicago and Illinois has deep, deep problems with corruption. If anybody thinks that this is going to sort of be the last Illinois politician to head to jail, gosh, that would be nice, but I think I'm going to be in business for a little while longer.
Yeah, it is, even with his conviction, even though we knew this was almost certainly coming, actually seeing it happen is quite remarkable.
And that it happened this week. I feel like if it would have happened maybe, a few weeks ago, we would have covered it a lot more, but just so many things are happening, and it's a big moment for Illinois.
Well, and we've seen, state lawmakers, Republican lawmakers saying, this is a dark day for Illinois. This is something we should be sad about. But I mean, realistically, in the day-to-day operations of the veto session, is this going to have much of an impact, do you think?
No, other than, showing up in GOP press releases, which they were very swift to do. Yeah. The Republicans will take any chance to tie Mike Madigan to the current party. And, it is kind of undeniable. I mean, Mike Madigan, he's responsible for generations and generations of lobbyists and lawmakers and special interests. And yeah, I mean, any other news cycle, that would be the tops for days on end. But yeah, there's a few other things going on around town.
A little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah, we're a little bit busy, but we've got a great group of folks helping us break it all down. But unfortunately, we are out of time. So our thanks to Mitchell Armentrout, Araceli Gomez-Saldana, Shruti Singh, and Heather Sharon. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Tonight's presentation of Week in Review is made possible in part by Ann and Rich Carr, BNSF Railway, and Francine and Dr. Anthony Brown. Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation. Additional support is provided by
And that's our show for this Friday night. No Kings protests are set to take place across the Chicago area tomorrow. Check out our website for more on what to expect and visit again tomorrow for the latest coverage of the demonstrations. Now for the Week in Review, I'm Nick Blumberg. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay informed. Have a great weekend. All right, we mentioned it at the top of the show. Some tragic news this week. The city's beloved rat hole was 98.67% likely to have been made by a squirrel.
What if this rat was what if this squirrel was a rat in spirit?
Yeah, a squirrel in a rat costume.
He can still be a rat in my heart. And I think
so.
I speak for all of Chicago when I say.
I feel like I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, obviously the name, but
Right.
you know, there's a lot of pride in Chicago squirrels. You know?
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm that gives back to the community through law and philanthropy.